Something unthinkable has happened in Hollywood, a story so intense and unpredictable that it has left even the most seasoned insiders speechless. Because what was once seen as the perfect fairy tale couple, Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, has now become the epicenter of one of the most shocking legal and media firestorms the industry has ever seen. The laughter, the love, the flawless red carpet moments have all faded into the background as the courtroom lights take center stage and the story everyone thought they knew begins to unravel piece by piece behind the glamorous smiles and clever banter a storm has been brewing. And when it finally broke, it sent shockwaves across the entire entertainment world. What began as a simple disagreement turned into a chain reaction that no one could have predicted now, with the arrival of powerhouse attorney Brian Freedman. Everything has changed because when Freedman steps in, he doesn't just fight cases, he rewrites narratives, and in this case, he's rewriting the legacy of two of Hollywood's brightest stars. The question isn't just who will win, it's who will survive. Because when reputations become ammunition and careers hang in the balance, the truth becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. The story begins in a place that seemed untouchable. The world of Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, the couple adored for their wit, their warmth, and their perfect image, had become Hollywood royalty. For years, fans had watched them share playful moments online, attend glamorous premieres, and raise a family that seemed straight out of a movie. Their love story was the kind people believed in, the kind that made headlines for all the right reasons. But beneath the charm, a conflict was quietly forming, one that would soon threaten to consume everything they had built. It all started during the promotion of Blake's latest film, It Ends With Us, a project that was meant to mark a new chapter in her career, and instead became the catalyst for chaos during the press tour. Blake made comments about her co-star and director Justin Baldoni, suggesting that he had created a tense and difficult work environment. At first, the remarks seemed minor, the kind of tension that sometimes surfaces on film sets, but in the days that followed, whispers turned into headlines and headlines turned into accusations. Suddenly, Baldoni found himself painted as a villain in a narrative that was spreading faster than anyone could control. For a moment, it looked like Blake had the upper hand. Public sympathy leaned her way, and social media users flooded timelines with messages of support. She was being hailed as brave and outspoken, the voice of accountability in a system that too often silences women, but behind the scenes, another story was unfolding. Justin Baldoni wasn't backing down. He maintained his innocence, insisting that Blake's claims were not only false but malicious, and that they had been designed to damage his career. Then came the moment that changed everything. Baldoni brought in Brian Freedman, a name that carries weight in every corner of Hollywood. Freedman is known not for compromise, but for victory. His style is sharp, calculated, and precise. When he steps into a case, people pay attention, and when his name appeared on the first legal filing against Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, the tone of the entire situation shifted overnight. Freedman's arrival meant this was no longer a PR dispute. It was now a full-scale legal confrontation. From the beginning, Freedman made one thing clear. His mission wasn't just to defend Justin Baldoni, it was to expose the truth as he saw it, and to dismantle any falsehoods that had been built around him. His strategy was to go straight for the foundation of Blake and Ryan's brand, the power couple image that had shielded them from criticism for years. He filed countersuits not only against Blake, but also against Ryan, their business ventures, and even certain media outlets that had published Blake's claims. In doing so, he sent a signal to the industry. No one was beyond accountability, and no reputation was too polished to be challenged. The first court documents were explosive, alleging that Blake had orchestrated a campaign to discredit Baldoni, using her influence in Hollywood media and social platforms to manipulate public opinion. Freedman's filings painted a picture of premeditated intent, suggesting that Blake's statements during the press tour were part of a broader strategy designed to control the narrative around the film and its production. As the filings made their way into the public record, the media storm intensified even further. News outlets began dissecting every line of the legal documents, while fans across social media debated which side they believed. One camp insisted Blake was being unfairly targeted, while another pointed to the precision of Freedman's legal arguments as proof that there was more to the story than anyone realized. And at the center of it all were Blake and Ryan, whose lives were suddenly under more scrutiny than ever before. The couple's brand partnerships began to feel the heat. Reports surfaced that certain companies were reevaluating their associations with them. and insiders whispered that studio executives were nervous about future projects. Every move, every statement, every post was analyzed for clues about what might come next. What once had been the most polished partnership in Hollywood now appeared fragile, vulnerable, and uncertain. Meanwhile, Freedman's confidence only seemed to grow with each new development. He gave no public comment, but his filings spoke volumes. Every motion carried a sense of authority and precision that left observers stunned. It wasn't just about proving his client's innocence, it was about showing the world that power and influence could not override accountability. As weeks turned into months, the case evolved into something far greater than anyone had imagined. It was no longer just Blake versus Justin. It had become a mirror, reflecting the darker side of fame and the high cost of perception in an industry built on image. The battle lines were drawn, and the war had only just begun. The escalation that followed could only be described as cinematic. The kind of twist no one saw coming, and yet everyone was waiting for, because once Brian Freedman entered the ring, the tone of the entire conflict shifted from defensive to devastating. His strategy wasn't simply to counter Blake Lively's allegations, it was to dismantle the very foundation of her credibility piece by piece. And he did it with the precision of a surgeon, but the force of a storm. Court insiders described his filings as methodical, relentless, and unyielding, each document designed not only to defend Justin Baldoni, but to send a message to Hollywood itself that unchecked narratives and public manipulation would no longer go unanswered. Freedman had studied the couple's dynamic, their public image, their intertwined business ventures, and he understood that their strength was also their vulnerability. Because when two brands become one, the fall of either threatens them both. And that's exactly where he struck. He targeted Blake and Ryan not as individuals, but as a united entity, and the impact was immediate. Suddenly, rumors began swirling that Ryan Reynolds had been named in portions of the lawsuit, not because he was directly involved, but because his public defense of his wife had been cited as part of a coordinated effort to shape public opinion. Freedman's legal framing was cold and exact. It wasn't about emotion, it was about evidence, about control, about who could prove that truth. Wasn't just what people believed, it was what could stand in court. And with each passing day, Blake and Ryan found themselves deeper in a battle that felt less like litigation and more like reputation warfare. What shocked everyone most was how quickly the couple's once unshakable image began to fracture. Brands that had lined up to collaborate were now quietly pulling away. Social media. Sentiment shifted, and the same audiences that had once cheered them on were suddenly hesitant, uncertain, and divided. It wasn't just the public that noticed. Even within Hollywood, whispers began to spread that the couple's influence was fading. Studio executives started to hesitate on contracts. Projects were rumored to be on hold, and meetings that once came easily were suddenly rescheduled with vague explanations. Blake's team tried to regain control, but every attempt to steer the narrative back in her favor only seemed to add more fuel to the fire. Freedman's filings referenced press leaks, statements, and interviews that contradicted earlier claims, and in the court of public opinion, that inconsistency became the story itself. Ryan, who had built his career on charisma and relatability, was now faced with a dilemma: support his wife publicly and risk further entanglement, or stay silent and face accusations of abandoning her. The balance between personal loyalty and professional survival had never been more precarious. Meanwhile, Justin Baldoni maintained a calm exterior, rarely speaking but always watching, and every move his attorney made reinforced the perception that he was winning the war of patience. While others scrambled around him, the press began referring to Freedman as Hollywood's legal assassin, a title that reflected both admiration and fear. His reputation was built on precision, but it was his ability to control the narrative that made him formidable. Each court filing seemed to anticipate the next move of his opponents, leaving them perpetually reacting instead of leading, and in a town where perception is power, that loss of control was devastating. Blake Lively's PR team reportedly met around the clock, crafting responses designed to sound calm and collected. But behind the scenes, panic was setting in. Insiders close to her described a growing tension, a fear that no matter how much she tried to redirect attention, the focus always returned to one name: Brian Freedman. As the case developed, the emotional toll became impossible to ignore. Blake appeared less frequently in public events, her once vibrant confidence dimmed by the constant shadow of the courtroom. Ryan maintained his composure, But the strain was visible even in small gestures, and brief interviews gone were the lighthearted jokes and effortless charm replaced instead by a cautiousness that hinted at exhaustion. The couple that once represented Hollywood perfection now seemed human, fragile, and under siege, and yet for all their challenges, the world couldn't look away. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a spectacle, a cautionary tale unfolding in real time, and every update, every leak, every whispered rumor added another layer of suspense. Freedman, meanwhile, pressed forward. Undeterred, he wasn't content with legal victory alone. He was crafting a legacy, a statement that in an industry where image has long been shielded from consequence, truth would still prevail, even if it came at a cost. But what no one expected was how far that cost would reach. The lawsuit itself had already shaken their careers, but the ripple effects began spreading far beyond Hollywood. Endorsements started vanishing. Projects quietly dissolved, and business ventures that once seemed unbreakable began to falter. Reports surfaced that Blake's hair care line faced declining sales, with some retailers quietly discontinuing products, while online discussions dissected every possible reason behind it. Fans debated whether they could separate the artist from the controversy, and in that hesitation lay the real damage. It wasn't the legal documents that hurt most. It was the erosion of trust, the subtle but unstoppable shift in public perception that no PR team could fully reverse. Ryan's situation was no better. Whispers about his standing with major studios began to circulate, with some insiders claiming that upcoming projects were being quietly reevaluated, though no official confirmation ever came. It was enough to ignite speculation, and in Hollywood, perception is often more powerful than truth. Through it all, Freedman continued to operate like a strategist commanding an invisible chessboard, where every move had purpose and every silence carried meaning. Those who had underestimated him now understood why his name inspired both respect and fear. He wasn't playing for settlements, he was playing for control of the story itself. And that's what made his involvement so terrifying. Because in an age where information travels faster than fact, controlling the story is the ultimate weapon, and Freedman was a master at wielding it. Blake and Ryan were learning that lesson in real time, watching as the narrative they had spent years perfecting began to unravel in ways they couldn't stop or predict. And the deeper they fell into the chaos, the more Hollywood began to turn its gaze inward, wondering if this was merely an isolated scandal or a sign that the age of untouchable stars had finally ended. The storm was far from over, but for Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, the hardest chapter was only just beginning. The third act of this unfolding storm began with silence, but it was the kind of silence that comes before an explosion, because when the courtroom doors opened again, what emerged sent new waves of shock through Hollywood. The filings had grown sharper, the tone more urgent, and now names that had previously stayed on the periphery were being pulled into the spotlight. Freedman's next move was as strategic as it was ruthless. He expanded the scope of the case, not only pressing forward against Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, but also taking aim at the machinery that had helped build their narrative: the PR firms, the publications, and the media, allies who had echoed their side of the story. He made it clear that the days of consequence-free spin were over, and in doing so, he turned what had begun as a dispute between two creative partners into a sprawling confrontation with the entire Hollywood publicity system. His message was simple: accountability would no longer stop at the talent, and the result was chaos. The media that had once rallied behind Blake began to hesitate. Editorials grew more cautious, and interviews that had been scheduled were quietly canceled. Even outlets known for their loyalty began to distance themselves. Freedman's filings referenced inconsistencies in previously published articles, and within days, corrections began appearing on websites and headlines. Softened, it was a visible retreat, and it showed just how much control he had seized without ever stepping in front of a camera. What made this phase of the battle so fascinating was how psychological it became. Freedman wasn't just fighting in court. He was dismantling confidence. He knew that perception shaped power, and every moment of doubt he created weakened the opposing side while strengthening his client's position. Observers inside the courtroom noted that Blake's demeanor had changed from assertive to subdued. Her responses more cautious, her tone more measured. It was as if she knew that any word could be turned against her. Ryan Reynolds, meanwhile, had begun to retreat from the public eye, the actor known for his humor. And warmth now appeared distant, the sparkle that once defined him replaced by visible tension. In rare appearances, he maintained professionalism, but insiders could sense the weight of the ongoing legal storm. It wasn't just a professional threat. It was personal, and the walls were closing and reports began to circulate that Blake's team had attempted to limit media access and control which outlets were allowed to cover her appearances, a strategy that only further fueled speculation rather than calming it. What was once perceived as confidence began to look like fear. And fans noticed social media comments turned skeptical followers who had once defended the couple began to question everything from their motives to their authenticity. The internet had turned from a platform of adoration to a stage of interrogation, and there was no escaping it. At this point, even Hollywood insiders began to quietly admit that the narrative had changed. Freedman wasn't simply winning in court, he was winning in perception, and that was far more dangerous for two stars whose livelihoods depended on public. Favor the phrase reputation. Fatigue began circulating in industry discussions. Executives and producers, wary of controversy, began steering clear, and suddenly offers that had once seemed guaranteed were no longer arriving. There was no formal blacklist, but the effect was the same. Blake's business ventures began to feel the strain. Reports of slow sales and withdrawn brand partnerships were whispered in boardrooms, while Ryan faced similar speculation about the status of his future with major franchises like Marvel. Whether true or not, didn't matter. The rumor itself was enough to cause damage, and that was the brilliance of Freedman's campaign. Every piece of uncertainty worked in his favor. Meanwhile, Justin Baldoni continued to project. Calm, his public statements were minimal, and his appearances calculated. Yet the tide of sympathy had begun to turn back toward him slowly, but unmistakably. After months of being framed as the antagonist, he was now being perceived as the professional, who had endured a storm of false accusations and fought back with composure and patience. His silence became his strength, and it contrasted sharply with the noise surrounding the couple. Freedman understood the value of restraint. He knew that sometimes saying less accomplished more. And as Blake and Ryan's side scrambled to explain, clarify, or defend each new revelation, Freedman's strategy of quiet precision grew more powerful. This balance between silence and dominance gave the impression that one side was unraveling, while the other was in full control. As the months passed, the case stopped being just about allegations or defamation. It became a symbol of something larger. It was about how fame could crumble under the weight of scrutiny, how truth could be twisted, and how control of the narrative had become the new currency of Hollywood. Every conversation in the industry circled back to the same question: how did the most beloved couple in Hollywood end up here? And could anyone ever recover from such a public fall? The answer remained uncertain, because even as new evidence surfaced and new claims were debated, the court of public opinion had already rendered its own kind of judgment. Trust once lost is rarely regained. And that was the mountain Blake and Ryan now faced. Climbing their fame, which had once been effortless, now felt heavy. The price of perfection had come due, and there was no easy way to pay it. For observers watching from the outside, the story had taken on a haunting quality. It was no longer just about two stars entangled in a legal dispute. It was about what happens when the image of invincibility meets the reality of consequence. Freedman's involvement had made the case legendary, but it also raised questions that lingered long after the headlines faded. Could justice exist in a world built on perception? Could accountability coexist with celebrity? And perhaps most haunting of all, if this could happen to them, what would stop it from happening to anyone else? The answers would come slowly, if at all. But one thing was certain. The storm that had begun as a whisper on a film set had grown into something far greater than anyone had imagined. And for Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, the fight for their reputation had only just begun. In the end, what began as a misunderstanding between colleagues evolved into one of the most talked about legal and public relations battles in modern Hollywood history. It became more than a lawsuit. It became a reckoning, a collision between truth and image, between perception and accountability, between the illusion of perfection and the reality of human error. For Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, the story transformed from a fairy tale into a cautionary tale. Their lives, once defined by laughter and love, now became symbols of how fragile reputation can be when the spotlight turns cold. Their silence now carries a heavier meaning. Their smiles no longer just expressions of charm, but reminders of what has been lost along the way. For Justin Baldoni and Brian Freedman, the case marked something different. A restoration of balance in an industry that often rewards noise over integrity. Freedman's methodical approach reminded, everyone that beneath the glitz and glamour, the law remains the great equalizer. It doesn't bow to status or charm. It only listens to evidence and intent. And in that sense, this case wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about drawing. A line in the sand, a reminder that narratives built on illusion will eventually crumble under the weight of truth. Hollywood will move on as it always does. But the echo of this battle will linger. It will become a reference point whispered in boardrooms, discussed in legal seminars, and studied in media ethics classrooms, because in exposing the fragility of fame, this case revealed something far more universal: the cost of control, the danger of power without accountability, and the reality that no matter how perfect a story appears behind every headline, there is a truth waiting to surface, and when it does, nothing is ever the same again.